Mr John Redwood.
Thank you, Mr Amos. I have always been a unionist, but my idea of my country, the United Kingdom, is it must be a democracy at peace with itself, and it can only proceed as a happy and successful democracy if it has the consent of most of the people most of the time to the union institutions and to the powers of those union institutions. And I'm pleased that because we proceed democratically and we understand the need for consent, that this Parliament listened to Scotland and granted a referendum quite recently to see if it was the settled will of the Scottish people that they simply wanted to leave the United Kingdom altogether and set up their own arrangements. And we discovered from that democratic exercise two things. We discovered that the Scottish National Party itself didn't actually argue for full independence. It wanted to stay part of the currency union, for example, and I don't see how you can conceivably have an independent country and be part of a currency union. Give way.
Monsieur, if they're suggesting that Germany is not an independent nation.
It's not. And that is exactly the problem. Germany is not an independent nation. No member of the Eurozone is an independent nation. And that is why they're having such trouble. And the trouble is not just for Greece, which is very visibly not independent, because Greece is being told how to conduct her economic policy, but nor is Germany independent. Germany did not wish to lend Greece huge sums of money, but the European Central Bank, acting in the name of Germany, has advanced huge sums of money, which they're going to find very difficult to get back, which Germany has to stand behind. So, of course. But if the SNP would just allow me a little, I'm going to say things that they will like. I'm not trying to make life difficult for them. And my analysis is this, that having in the referendum gone for something more akin to home rule than for what I would regard as full independence, even that, at that stage, the Scottish people said no to. And they seem to say yes to rather larger devolution of powers, which the three main unionist parties were then offering. But we now have new circumstances, and I do, like my honourable friend, who's just a spit, who moved the very interesting amendment. Oh, he is there. Oh, he's gone there. Like my honourable friend who moved the very interesting amendment, I do think this Parliament has to listen to the new voice of the Scottish people, and it is very clear that there was a shift of opinion towards more home rule, I think, than the unionist parties were offering at the time of the referendum. And that is why we are here today listening very carefully to what the SNP has to say. And that is why I think it is extremely important that we have this debate on full fiscal independence or fiscal autonomy, because that would be one way for this Parliament to respond to the Scottish people saying, no, we don't want to be completely independent as a separate country, but we want much more self-government or home rule than was envisaged by the union parties at the time of the referendum, because we must see that that wasn't very popular. The union parties collectively did rather badly come the general election in Scotland. Well, the union parties between them got just under half the vote, and the Scottish Nationalist Party got just over half the vote. And because the unionist vote was split, they got practically no members elected. But it's still the case that Scottish opinion is fairly evenly balanced. The Scottish Nationalists didn't get 70 or 80% of the vote. If they had done, then, as far as I'm concerned, they could really tell us what the answer was. But they only speak for around half the Scottish people as judged by the vote. But as representatives, they speak for the whole Scottish people, or practically the whole Scottish people, because they have most of the members in this place. So I'm listening very carefully and will want to hear more about what they want. But I'm also very conscious that in parallel to this exercise on powers through this piece of legislation, in some way far more important negotiations are already underway, but not yet being reported to this House, over what the new financial settlement will be. And the new financial settlement is crucial not just to the SNP and their representation of the Scottish people, but it is also crucial to the people of England. And I find that the more home rule that is on offer and the more we hear the Scottish voice, the more I have to be not an advocate of the Union, but an advocate of England. Because someone needs to speak for England, and someone needs to say that the consequences of much enhanced Scottish devolution and some fiscal devolution as well are quite serious for England, and England needs to be in the debate and discussion just as Scotland does, because this is our joint country and a very major change in its arrangements will have a very fundamental impact on England. And whilst I am very attracted to my honourable friend's idea that it would be a shrewd move for once to get ahead of the Scottish appetite for Home Rule and on this occasion to grant full fiscal devolution, I think we do need to ask how feasible that is and what are the consequences for Scotland and for England. Because if, for example, Scotland wishes to be part of common welfare and pension guarantees, then there is some limitation already imposed upon the spending side of full fiscal devolution. And we have to think about the position of England if there are cross guarantees being offered for some part of that welfare package. If we are going to proceed in the way that the government, I think, is currently planning to proceed and the way that the negotiations are currently being undertaken, as I understand it, there is an attempt to find a way of adjusting the block grant for Scotland, both to take into account the new Scottish responsibilities, so there will be some extra items of spending which have to be added in as a result of devolution of new functions, and a reduction in the block grant to take account of those taxes which are now Scotland's to fix and to collect. And therein lies an immediate problem. I give way.
Wouldn't an easier solution be that Scotland collects its own taxes, indeed Catalonia does, and then pays into the centre, rather than the centre paying out? Because actually the taxes should be raised by the government, the territory are paying the taxes, and then paid centrally, rather than given to the centre and give out. And then the centre can stop saying it's subsidising people when it returns their own taxes.
But say Scotland wisely decided to have lower tax rates to make themselves more popular, then the Union is losing out if those lower tax rates collect less money. So do you want to give way?
Honourable gentlemen should realise it's not lower taxes that have made the SNP more popular. It is better public services in Scotland that has made the SNP more popular and given us 50% versus his 37%.
Then if Scotland wishes to impose higher taxes, then the Union has less of a problem with that, unless, of course, they choose to impose higher tax rates which actually collect less revenue, which then could be a problem for the Union as a whole. But it would be a problem for them if they had to collect higher tax levels and they didn't get all the money back. They would obviously want to get all of the extra money back, I would have thought, that they were collecting, which is why full fiscal autonomy means you take responsibility both for raising the money and for spending the money. So if Scotland wishes to spend more under fiscal autonomy, she can spend more if she has a magic way of getting more money off people by either higher or lower tax rates, whichever ones work in the particular circumstances that we would be looking at in their fiscal equation. So my worry is this, that we need to have working papers before us on how full fiscal devolution might work and whether it is truly full fiscal devolution. Because from the point of view of England, if we are going to full fiscal devolution, England will want guarantees that we are no longer acting as a buffer or subsidising the Scottish settlement, just as Scotland would want guarantees that she'd got a fair deal and was capturing the benefits of her fiscal independence. If we go for a mixed system, which is where we currently are with the real debate between the Smith Commission pro-union parties and the SNP in negotiation, there is a lot to be worked out, and I hope at some point the Treasury bench will want to share some of this thinking with the House.
I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman, and I'm finding myself in the unusual position of agreeing with much of what he's setting out. Doesn't this actually show the asymmetrical nature of the devolution settlement across the four nations of the United Kingdom, and that whichever funding model you go for in terms of the Scottish question, there are implications for the finances of the other three nations of the United Kingdom? Doesn't he think we need a constitutional convention to put that right?
No, I don't think we need a constitutional convention, because I think that would endlessly delay and create all sorts of complications. I agree with previous comments that we are here to try and solve this problem for our respective constituents. I spent quite a lot of my time in the election speaking for England, saying that I would want to make sure that England got a reasonable deal out of this. SNP representatives clearly did the same in Scotland, and we had similar levels of success in attracting lots of votes for what we were saying.
The honourable gentleman, he talks about making good deals for various parts of the UK. If we look at the wider British Isles, does he imagine that the aggregate GDP of the British Isles would be as high as it is today without the full fiscal autonomy that the Republic of Ireland enjoys, the full fiscal autonomy the Isle of Man enjoys, and the full fiscal autonomy that the UK enjoys? And would he therefore, if he does agree that the aggregate GDP of the British Isles is higher because of that, won't it be higher still when Scotland has its full fiscal autonomy?
Well, I start from the point of view of democracy, and to me, if you want to live in a democratic state, it has to have the full range of powers. And so it needs to have fiscal autonomy in its own currency and all the rest of it. And that is a different argument from what is your state. Now, I would still rather have the United Kingdom as my state, but I've just explained to the honourable gentleman that if it is going to become the will of the Scottish people that the UK is no longer their preferred state, then they must leave. Of course they must. I give way.
The honourable gentleman, he's been very kind in enabling the dialogue to continue. You would also agree, I'm sure, that the UK functioned between 1603 and 1707 when the parliaments were independent.
Well, it functioned after a fashion, but I wouldn't want myself to live through that time, and they were clearly not nearly as rich as we are today. Although sometimes the Labour Party tries to pretend that we've gone back to some ancient age. I'm sure none of them would willingly go back in time and live in those times, because we are obviously so much better off.
I wanted to divert from the subject, but wasn't the fact that in 1707 the reason for the Scots enthusiasts going forward wasn't economic blockade, it was speculation in the colonies in Central America?
Yes, it was a kind of early version of the banking crash, which also reminded us that Scottish banks can sometimes get into trouble, and then the union insurance can be quite helpful for those Scottish banks. So,
I wonder if I could return the discussion back to the here and the now. Can I just clarify what the member was saying, because I think I agree with him, that there is a clear desire post-Smith, in the debate that took place post-Smith, in Scotland, for a fuller measure of complete domestic fiscal control within the UK. But to achieve that will require serious discussion between how it would work in Scotland and fiscal arrangements in the rest of the UK. It could be done reasonably quickly. It would require transitional arrangements. It cannot be done overnight, but it is the way to go, because if we do not do that, we will end up in this endless piecemeal discussion, and it will actually, I think, ultimately produce more friction than light.
Making an even more urgent point than that, and I'm saying that it is going on as a discussion whilst we have this debate about a piece of legislation. It's going on in parallel. I hope it will be shared with the House at some point, because I think it is of great UK importance, English importance, Scottish importance, and so forth. And that I think in the negotiations they're having, as I understand it, they are up against these very issues, that if they give too much independence to Scotland on spending patterns, then is there going to be a union guarantee to pay for all that, or is there not? And how would that be fair to other parts of the union if Scotland can raise her spending without having to take responsibility for raising the money for it? If Scotland starts to raise more of her own money, how do you adjust the block grant? Because in the current negotiations, nobody is suggesting getting rid of the block grant and saying that Scotland can have all her own money and just spend her own money. And I'm not even sure that's what the SNP want. And so there is the negotiation going on at the moment about how far you go. Well, if the SNP genuinely want all that, that is fine. And, of course, you then have to have a serious discussion before it could be agreed to over the borrowing. And I will call it borrowing. I don't think black hole is a terribly useful term. It is quite obvious that the United Kingdom has been living well beyond its means as a state for many years and is still borrowing large sums of money. And it is quite obvious that collectively the United Kingdom, including Scotland, has built up those debts, and some of that money has been spent in Scotland and some of that money has been spent in England. And you would have the issue, if you went for so-called full fiscal autonomy, of what do you do about the new borrowing and what do you do about the past borrowing? Because all the time you remain in a currency union, one thing surely we've learnt from Greece and other places in the euro currency union is that the borrowing of a state in a currency union is of great concern and interest to the rest of the currency union. And so there would have to be an agreement on borrowing, past debt levels attributed to Scotland, because they'd have to pay an interest bill on those, and future build-up of Scottish debt, and would that be separate Scottish debt, or is it still with the full union guarantee, which would probably make it a bit cheaper? And that becomes the centre of the row rather than over which taxes you have.
Would the honourable gentleman not agree that the successive Westminster governments could learn much from economic management from the Scottish Parliament, which has balanced its budget in a fixed budget every single year, while Westminster has run up successive debts?
Well, because all the time it is a subsidiary Parliament of the Union, and part of our public expenditure and borrowing plans, of course, it has to abide by the remit. And the Honourable Lady is right, it's been given a tougher remit than the Union gives itself. But it's not fair to say that that is of no interest or benefit to Scotland, because, of course, much of the Union expenditure is also being committed proportionately in Scotland, and so it is Scotland's share of the debt as well. Anyway, I'm making a factual statement. I'm not trying to make party political points. I'm not trying to wind up the SNP or rerun the referendum or anything like that. I'm just trying to get this House to understand that there are grave and big issues being hammered out elsewhere, which we're not hearing about. They impinge very much on this crucial debate we're now having. I've intervened because I just want an opportunity to talk about this financial settlement, which matters to England as well as to Scotland. And my honourable friend's amendment brings it centre stage, that if we went his route and had full fiscal autonomy, I would want to know what that meant. How much responsibility does Scotland take for pensions as well as welfare, for example? And I would want to know what the borrowing settlement was, because the residual is the borrowing. And unless you know what the answer to that is, you still won't have a happy union or a stable expenditure.
Thank the honourable member for his most gracious speech, and I think thoughtful remarks about the future of the constitutional arrangements between Scotland and the rest of the UK. It's perhaps worth remembering that when Gordon Brown spoke on behalf of the three unionist parties prior to the referendum, what was offered was as close to federalism as we could get. What was talked about was home rule in the spirit of Keir Hardie. It is actually akin to the remarks that the honourable gentleman is making. And it's perhaps worth remembering that the manifesto commitment that the SNP stood on was delivering powers for a purpose to the Scottish Parliament. And I think he's absolutely right. That's what the Scottish people voted for in returning 56 members of Parliament to this chamber.
Have another debate on another day which looks at what is actually going on at the moment on these very important financial discussions, because whilst my constituents are interested in what powers Scotland gets, they're far more interested in how the money works between the different parts of the Union. And we have no papers before us today to elucidate that.
To the right honourable gentleman for giving way, and for the second time in 5 and a bit years I agree with him. But in terms of the complicated nature of the fiscal framework that I believe he's trying to unpack, would he not agree then that our new clause, which will be debated at some point in the committee stage of this House, to set up an independent commission on the costs and implications of full fiscal autonomy, would be a much more reasonable and sensible approach?
Well, I think we are where we are. Promises were made, I thought, in good faith by the three front benches. They weren't my chosen promises. They were made on behalf of the three unionist parties. They did the job for the referendum. They then didn't do much of a job for the unionist parties come the general election. But I don't think we can now be seen to be delaying at any great length. There needs to be proper work, and I'm sure there is proper work going on in government at the moment, trying to work out a financial settlement in parallel to this bill. I'm just suggesting that maybe this Parliament needs to have some of that thinking shared with it, and today is the first opportunity within the clear parameters of the very general new clause moved by my honourable friend to try and expose a bit of the thinking on how a limited amount of fiscal autonomy will work, how many of these taxes that Scotland is not only going to collect but be responsible for and have knocked off the block grant. And as I remember the leaders going together with this promise, Gordon Brown was a big voice off, although he obviously wasn't one of the leaders at the time. And I think he was a voice for rather less fiscal autonomy, because I seem to remember what he was trying to do was to stop Scotland controlling her own income tax revenues. So he was trying to put a restraint on that, so I don't entirely share the Labour front bench's interpretation of what Mr Brown was at that point trying to do. So I will bring my remarks to a close with just this simple conclusion that the world has moved on because of the general election result, that the debate about money is taking place elsewhere, but we currently have a short debate about money here, and I do hope the front bench will share a bit of their thoughts on money, because fiscal devolution seems to be attractive to many people in Scotland, but where does it end, and how do you sort out all those crucial issues about debt and borrowing, as well as about shared policies like pensions?